So we just recently had the autumn statement and therefore a budget, right? And as is customary at the time at which we have a budget, it gets scrutinised in the House of Commons Select Committee. Apparently, this one kicks off. It's a fiery one. I mean, it's literally titled Jeremy Hunt Getting Rinsed by MPs. So that should be interesting. Let's have a look and see what Jeremy Hunt has to say for himself.
How stupid do you think the British people are? You raise taxes by the equivalent of 10p in national insurance and then cut national insurance by 2p. You refuse to raise the tax thresholds for 6 years. You and I both know that that people will be paying £1,200 more in tax as a result of your measures. Aren't people right that you've been gouging with one hand and giving crumbs back with the other?
That is absolutely not what has been happening.
I mean, it literally is exactly what happened, right? Are you just going to deny that you have predicted lots of fiscal drag for the next few years up until 2028, which will overall increase the tax burden, not bring it down? And so much so, in fact, that the vast majority of that extra tax burden is not going to be placed on the most vulnerable. It's being applied in a regressive manner because the people who are benefiting the most from the reduction in national insurance are people on higher incomes rather than lower incomes.
I think it was absolutely right that we helped businesses through the pandemic, protecting 9 million jobs, meaning that we had one of the fastest recoveries from the pandemic of any large European country.
I mean, that's not the question that was asked, right? The question was asked was about overall tax burden and where those taxes are going to be placed. The question wasn't about whether or not we had lots of growth coming out of the pandemic. It's true, we have had a good recovery out of the pandemic, but we also had one of the biggest drops in terms of economic size during the pandemic. All right, second only to Japan in terms of as G20 countries, how much they lost in terms of GDP throughout the actual era of lockdown. So it stands to reason that we would have jumped up further because we had a lower floor to be able to come up from, right? Even then, we're still doing better than some economies like Germany. But why is it the Germans still have higher living standards than we do? Is it because their growth is sustainable in manufacturing, being put back into the hands of consumers and workers, whereas here it's just in terms of fake growth, in terms of how much extra our assets have appreciated by all these extra transactions happening in the financial sector? But that's not the same kind of sustainable growth, or indeed growth that would then translate into higher living standards for people, which is really what this is about, right? This isn't about numbers on graphs. This isn't about red line going up. This is about actual money in people's pockets, actual people's living standards. And when you look at it, we've had the biggest drop in living standards since the Napoleonic Wars. So you can fanny around with all the numbers that you've pre-prepared for this meeting, Jeremy, but that's not going to actually increase my standard of living at the end of the day, is it? No, didn't think so.
Country, and I think it was absolutely right, about £400 billion of support there, and about £100 billion of support in the cost of living crisis caused principally by the invasion of Ukraine. And I
just want to, again, I know I say this every time, but I have to make it abundantly clear. The reason why we had to give out hundreds of billions of pounds during the cost of living crisis that was indeed, as is correctly stated there, generated by the invasion of Ukraine, is because we were vulnerable to energy price shocks, right? Which was caused by sanctions placed upon Russia and the withdrawal of Russian gas from the European markets. If we had had better energy policy, we wouldn't have been as vulnerable. That's your fault. The Conservative Party's fault. That is neoliberalism's fault. That's the fault of every preceding government who didn't do a green transition. Every government who didn't bother nationalising our oil reserves in the North Sea. And the complete stark difference between Norway, who have renewable electricity generation and a gigantic sovereign wealth fund because they own 60% of the oil and gas in the North Sea and in the Barents Sea, right? They are not affected by the cost of living crisis in the same way that we are, right? You've given all of this extra money to subsidise people's energy bills, and they're still higher than bills on the continent because we have worse energy policy. But we're spending even more state money, right? You're claiming that this is being done to benefit us, but really all it's doing is papering over the cracks in your huge energy policy failures for 40 years of neoliberalism and privatisation, right? You can't say We have been generous when our bills are still higher than they are on the continent. All this is just showing you how poor your energy policy failures are, your industrial policy failures are.
I don't remember anyone on your side of Parliament or on mine saying that was the wrong thing to do, or indeed that was gouging. What they said, actually, we were right to step in and help families. But we're also honest with people that if you want to give that kind of level of support, then you have to pay for it. Now, what is different about the autumn statement is that having...
Okay, we could have paid for it with a proper windfall tax on all of the people who you gave our official expansion money to, right? All of that fiscal expansion, all that extra money in the economy went to subsidise the bills of energy giants who raked in record profits. You could have windfall taxed them, did you? No, you didn't. You had a get-out clause, so they didn't have to pay a bunch of the windfall tax. Now we are having to pay that back, not the energy companies, not the people who actually drilled the gas in the first place, who are getting off scot-free with massively jacked up oil and gas prices.
We've gone through a period where taxes had to go up in order to give that support. We're now in a position where, with inflation halved, with nearly every economic forecast increasing our growth rate, we are able to start to reduce the tax burden.
Can I ask how much tax do you think it's reasonable for a police sergeant, a senior nurse or a deputy head teacher to pay?
Well, as a result of the cuts to national insurance, an average teacher will get about £630 more next year. A nurse will be about £520, a police officer about £630 reduction.
But only in national insurance, right? How much extra tax are they going to pay afterwards? 2 years down the line worth of fiscal drag. What's the tax burden going to look like for these people? Right? And again, right, this could have been paid for differently. You made the political choice to ensure that all of these costs are being burdened upon working people, people with jobs, people who are productive, and not people who make money off trading assets, of watching their asset prices inflate, of owning stocks and shares, right? Capital gains tax not going up, no plans for a wealth tax, no engagement with things like dividends taxation. None of these things are changing. They're still rock bottom, right? Yeah, people who pay income taxes on actual productive income, productive work, those burdens are going up because of fiscal drag. You've made that political choice so that work doesn't pay in this country, despite all of these claims to the contrary.
That is a step towards relieving the pressure, but I wouldn't say for a moment that they haven't seen, as everyone has seen, just let me finish, they haven't seen their taxes go up.
I'm sorry, we get to be members of this committee and ask you questions rather than you tell us how long you're going to speak to us at. After the government tax measures, 182,765 nurses, 141,827 teachers and 60,680 police officers will fall into the 40% tax bracket. Is that who the upper tax bracket was intended for?
Well, one of the ways that we raised money, and by the way, all I was trying to do was answer your first question, so if you were kind enough to let me answer the questions, I will do my very best to do so. Now, you asked me about the freezing of tax thresholds, which I'm happy to talk about. It is true that one of the ways that we were able to fund that extra support for families during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis was by freezing tax thresholds. We then had a position in this autumn statement where it was possible to relieve tax pressure, and I took the choice to concentrate those efforts in areas that would grow the economy the most. And that was why Paul Johnson said yesterday that if you're going to reduce taxes, these were the right taxes to reduce. The national insurance cut that we were talking about means that you get about 100,000 more people, full-time equivalent, into the workforce. That helps growth. The business expensing increase in tax relief, full expensing, means that we will increase investment in the economy over the next 5 years.
Well, let me finish. By 14, you intended to go into the upper tax rate.
How do we pay for schools? How do we pay for hospitals? We pay.
I mean, you are funding them through the central bank, right? But then you're using taxation as a measure to control the money supply. Not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable, right? But what's a choice, right? You can't just decide not to tax people. Tax has to happen eventually, right? But it's a political choice. It is your political choice where that taxation comes from, and you're making the political choice to put that taxation upon productive members of society, right? That's a political choice that you have decided to make by increasing fiscal drag, meaning that more people are paying more tax on their earned income as productive members of society, right? That is a decision that you have taken. No one's saying that tax has to happen on this specific group of people. No one's saying that we should just not do any taxation, that we should cut taxes a la Kwasi Kwarteng, right? No one is saying this, apart from probably Kwasi Kwarteng himself still, right? But what you can do is choose to have that tax burden lie somewhere else, in the pockets of the rich, in the pockets of people who are unproductive, right? But you're choosing deliberately not to do these, and you're getting away with it through fiscal drag because you think people won't notice, because it's PAYE and people are very difficult to be able to avoid that kind of thing, right? It's your political choice that you've made. But fortunately, as Siobhan McDonough points out, to be fair, not my favourite MP, to say the least, but she's right to claim that Jeremy Hunt is literally acting like he thinks the public is stupid. But we will not notice that fiscal drag will increase our overall tax burden. Because it will. It's well reported now. We've been dealing with it for the last 2 years. We are fully cognizant of this now. And you can't just get away with trying to hide it under some kind of grandiose gesture of a small cut in national insurance whilst increasing taxes elsewhere at the same time.
Pay for it through the wealth generated by the economy. Now, what the OBR said is that the full expensing measure will increase investment by about £14 billion over the next 5 years, which means more growth, more tax revenues, more money for schools and hospitals.
Chancellor, could you remind me, who was it that said, if you put your hands into people's pockets and take money out of them, and they do not see visible improvements in the services they receive, they get very angry indeed. Our public services are crumbling, our rivers are full of sewage, 8 million people on NHS waiting lists, the highest since records began, and taxes at their highest since World War II. Do you think that the voters may be very, very angry by the time we get to the next election?
Well, I think the voters are very realistic that we
Whose
have
quote
had.
was that, by the way? Sorry.
I'm very well. I hope you'll tell me.
You.
Right. Then it's a very wise comment, and I think voters are very realistic about the fact that we have been through a global shock with the pandemic and a global shock with the energy crisis.
Yeah. Siobhan's been watching me call into Rachel Reeves, hasn't she?
And they want to see improvements in public services. And that's why they welcome the fact that, for example, since 2010, crime has halved, excluding computer crime and fraud, which weren't measured in 2010. But violent crime, burglaries have halved, that school standards have risen to their highest ever, that we have more doctors and nurses in the NHS, although it's still struggling to recover post-pandemic. But absolutely, I want to see standards in public services going up. And when it comes to river pollution, that's why I'm very pleased this government has required the water companies to invest over £50 billion over the years ahead to clean up our rivers.
Where's that money coming from, Jeremy? Right? Where's that money coming from? It's coming from our higher bills. And that's where that money is literally coming from, right? Things I will actually I'm going to be nice and give Jeremy Hunt a little bit of a leeway here. And that I genuinely think that he believes what he originally said there was true, right? And that we do need investment in public service to be able to get these things to a position where the Conservatives don't lose the next election, right? I don't think he's doing it because he genuinely believes in the efficacy of public services. I think he's doing it because he realises if they don't do it, electorally, they're completely dead. They're dead meat, right? But you then, again, we go back to the political choices that I was talking about. Where you say, we have forced the water companies to invest in cleaning up our rivers. Yeah, using our money, using the extra bills, right? At least, right? At least if it was being done through public money by a nationalised water firm, right? First of all, probably wouldn't have gotten to this position in the first place, as there would have been actual capital budgets allocated to maintaining our water sanitisation and maintaining clean waterways, for example, right? But even so, even if we nationalised it now and we spent public money rebuilding this, at least it would be done based upon people's ability to pay as far as progressive taxation is concerned. The increase in bills we are now paying to fix the failures of the privatised water system are going to be paid mostly by poor people in their monthly and quarterly bills, right? Everybody's going to be paying essentially the same unless you use loads of water for some reason. And so therefore the cost is going to be flat. It's like a poll tax on everybody in society for the basic access to the most important kind of compound that we require to be able to live, which is water. So this is the most regressive way that you could possibly do it.
I don't want to end on a bad note, so I wanted to.
I know you wouldn't.
So I want to congratulate you on a historic first. The first Parliament ever since records began where household disposable incomes actually fall. Living standards will fall by 3.1% between December 2019 and January 2025. Households on average will be £1,900 poorer at the end of this Parliament than at its start. Do you think that's a proud record?
Well, what everyone knows is that there are reasons why not just the UK but the whole world is seeing that pressure on living standards because of the exceptional events that we had with the pandemic and the energy crisis. But I would just point you to the fact that a year ago the OBR said that living standards were going to fall by 3.7%, and they've actually gone up by 2.5%. So under good conservative economic management, things turn out better.
I mean, you say conservative economic management, and whilst I will say his management of the economy has been better than we've had previously, right? Look at, if you compare Jeremy Hunt to George Osborne, right? I will take Jeremy Hunt every single day, right? But the conservative economic management is what got us into this mess in the first place. Like, we continually talk about, oh well, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, they've all screwed up the country, and that may be partially true, but all of the problems that we're seeing right now, literally every single problem that we've seen at the moment, is entirely down to George Osborne. George Osborne is the root cause of all of these problems, right? I made this point on Novara Media discussing this, in that the NHS is in the completely awful situation that it's in because of lack of capital funding for expansion of capacity, because of austerity cuts made by George Osborne, right? Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor under Boris Johnson, was the first Chancellor to actually massively increase NHS funding since 2010, right? Obviously, we're massively underprepared for a pandemic. Lots of that is pandemic spending, right? Capital investment is still too low, even if we are getting some of the 40 hospitals that we were promised. But these failures in levels of redundant capacity are a failure of George Osborne's, right? And that was conservative economic management. That was neoliberal economic management, right? That was this desire to treat overall deficit as being some kind of massive issue in terms of the way we did fiscal policy, rather than a necessary to be able to do Keynesian levels of growth, especially happening just after we had a recession in 2008, right? So conservative governance is what has got into this mess. And whilst you may say, oh, well, we're trying to invest in public services now, you've had 13 years to invest in public services, right? Neither George Osborne nor Philip Hammond decided that any of investment was worth it at the time, and they've left us with an entirely crumbling society, a crumbling public sphere, which, whilst you may try and fix it now, Jeremy, and believe that you can, whilst also making sure the burden of that fixation goes upon the people who are less able to actually pay for it, rather than rich people or people who are unproductive, that's another choice that you've made. The actual governance of the Conservative Party and Conservative ideology is why we are here in the first place, right? And that's what I want to get across, because people spend too much of their time talking about, oh, well, this person is bad, right? I can't believe we had the silly Boris Johnson, man, the man with the floppy hair, right? And whilst I have no good things to say about him as a person or as a character, right, we can't get fixated on people and individuals and prime ministers and figureheads. It's ideology that's the problem, right? It's the level to which the conservative fiscal policy for 45 years, or when it came to energy policy, when it came to austerity in the 2010s, when it came to the lax control of the banking industry leading up to 2008. These are all problems with conservative governance, conservative policy, right? You can change the face of conservatism all you want, but it'll still lead to these problems and they will continue to happen. And so by Jeremy Hunt coming to us and saying, well, actually, what we've done here is good conservative policy, I'm like, we've been dealing with all of the terrible aspects of conservative policy for all this time. Maybe it's time that we didn't have conservative policy for once. And maybe these problems would A, get fixed, B, wouldn't happen in the first place, and C, when they did happen, they wouldn't have to be paid for by us. Right? By you and I, regular people, rather than the rich bankers who caused the crash, the rich people who own the water companies who got sold off to Margaret Thatcher, or indeed all of the people in government who were giving crony contracts out to their mates at the time. Just a thought. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.